we're on the bottom of Ayin Beis Amud Aleph, 2 lines up from the bottom. It Tizbara, the Gemara tries to answer this question. You think that the reason for Rabbi Meir in the Brisa, in which he's mechayev him in the case where he was mal the Friday Mila on Shabbos, I should ask you the following question. Ma hasam, in that case, delo avid mitzvah. In other words, he didn't do a mitzvah when he, so now we're going to the Sefer, right? So in the Sefer, he circumcised the baby that was born only 7 days ago. It means it's a Sunday bris, and that's called Mila Kodem Zmana. That's not a mitzvah at all. He'll have to redo the Mila. And yet, Potar Rabbi Yeshua, according to Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yeshua would say you're Potar, even though he's not Makayim mitzvah at all, is how much more so, Heichadika Ovid mitzvah, in the first case, in the Reisha, where he circumcised a Friday baby on Shabbos on its 9th day, not on its 7th day, but its 9th day, is Mechayev. Rabbi Yeshua would say Yechayev in such a case. You have to reinterpret Rabbi Meir. We cannot understand Rabbi Meir on a surface level. Amri Tebei Rav Yanai, Reisha, the case where, according to Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yeshua admits that he's chayav, that's a case where he circumcised the Friday Mila on Shabbos. And what was the case? Kigon shekadamu mal shel Shabbos be Erev Shabbos. He made a complete swap between the two Tinokos, and the Shabbos bris he did on Friday. And he thought that the other baby was the Shabbos bris, and in fact, the other baby was a Friday bris. So on Shabbos, he didn't realize his mistake. He thought that now when he is circumcising the second baby, he's doing it in its time, its right time, and on Shabbos. And now we turn to Daf Yomi Pesachim. So even though according to his machshava, according to his toes, he was tarud, but nevertheless, he doesn't have anywhere a baby whose Mila overrides Shabbos. Lo nitno Shabbos li dochos. He's not involved in any Mila because that Mila that would have been dochos Shabbos he already implemented on Friday. But Seifa, in the case of the Seifa, where he circumcised the baby of the 9th day on Shabbos, nitno Shabbos li dochos etzlo, he has a baby that would override the Shabbos. He switched babies and he got the wrong baby, but at least at this point, he does have a chiyuv, an obligation to be mal a baby whose bris overrides the Shabbos. So he is called Torah b'mitzvah. And since his Tirda b'mitzvah caused him to make this mistake and he took the wrong baby and circumcised it, that's called Torah b'dvar mitzvah. So now we can begin to understand the distinction between the Reisha and the Seifa. And now we understand what Rabbi Meir said, what he meant when he said that you're patur, even in the case where he shechted other karbanos, like for example, a karban shlamim, l'shem murei tzibur, as a karban musaf. And we said that even if he shechted that karban, which was shlamim, l'shem musaf, after they'd already brought all the other karbanos musafim, but that we could understand. Hacha, hare nitno Shabbos lidachas eitzel karban tzibur, because there is such an element, an entity of a karban that overrides the Shabbos. That's to be the musafim that have to be brought on Shabbos. So therefore, Reb Meir says he's patur when he shechts a karban shlamim l'shem musafim, even though on this Shabbos they already brought those karbanos that would override the Shabbos, and he has no chiyuv to be makar them, but nevertheless he was tarud during this period of time with karbanos that override the Shabbos. He knows that there is such a thing as a karban that overrides the Shabbos. Now he made a mistake and he thought that this carbon is also a carbon that overrides Shabbos. It's one of those Musafim carbon. So the gram, the cause of his error was the fact that he was involved in, he was tarud in a Shabbostika Shchitas Hazev. So the Gemara is not happy with this. Why? Amalei Rav Ashi Rav Kahana Hachanami. Even in the Reish of the Bryce, in other words, when he circumcised a Friday bris on Shabbos, and he took the baby that was a Shabbos bris and he circumcised that baby on Friday, Hare Nitna Shabbos Lidachos, there is a halacha that you override the Shabbos for Mila, Eisel Tinokas the Alma. In other words, even though he doesn't have a baby that would override Shabbos because he circumcised that Shabbos baby on Friday, but nevertheless, there is out there in the Veld, there is a Tinok that was born on Shabbos whose bris overrides the Shabbos. So therefore, even Rabbi Meir should agree that he's potter in this case. Amalei, so Rav Kana responds, L'gabe Hai Gavra Miaslo is Yair. There is no baby that would whose mila would be given, so to speak, to override the Shabbos as far as this moel is concerned, because you can talk about other moelim and other babies, but not as far as his situation is concerned. The Mishnah says, "Shar calls v'achim sheshaftam yidal nisan shchalios b'Shabbos l'shum Pesach." So he shechted a carbon shlomim l'shem Pesach. And this was the sefer of our Mishnah that records machlokes and einam re'uyim. If he shechted a cow, so then for sure chayiv even according to Rabbi Yeshua. But im re'uyim heim lePesach, if he shechted a seh ben shnosel that was designated for a carbon shlomim, and he decided he's shechting it for a Pesach, Rabbi Eliezer mechayiv chatos, Rabbi Yeshua patur. Man tana deshani le ben re'uyim. This distinction between a species that could be a carbon pesach and another one that's not, who is the Tana who presented the Shita of Rabbi Yoshua that distinguishes between Re'uyim and Einam Re'uyim, and he patters up the shochet of a Shlomim when he does it L'Shem Pesach, only in a case where it's Ra'ui, where it is a Seh. Rabbi Shimoni, this Sanya we learned in the Brisa with regard to shechting a carbon shlomim on Shabbos for the purpose of a Pesach. Echad zvachim aru'uyim, the echad zvachim shenim aru'uyim. Okay, so this is not Rabbi Shimon. This is Rabbi Meir. We'll get to Rabbi Shimon in a minute. Let's not get confused. So now the Brisa first records the sheet of Rabbi Meir that it matters not whether it was a seh, it was a lamb, or it was a cow, whether it's roy or ain't a roy. Or if he shechts a carbon shlomim for the purpose of tmidim umusafim, which would be docha Shabbos patur. In other words, once he was mafresh these karbanos, he was already tarud, he was already preoccupied in his mind, and he knew that there is some carbon here that has to override, that has to be shechted on Shabbos. And that caused him to make a mistake, and he shechted l'shem Pesach or l'shem imurei tzibur, all kinds of intentions for the good for karbanos that override the Shabbos. So that's called Torah b'dvar mitzvah divrei Rabbi Meir. So again, according to Rabbi Meir, in his version of Rabbi Yeshua, there's no difference between a cow and a lamb. Rabbi Shimon lo nechleku Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yeshua. Al she'enam ru'im shechayav, even Rabbi Yeshua would agree that if it's a cow or a calf for that matter, he's chayav achatos. That's not called Torah b'dvar mitzvah, because everybody knows that you cannot bring a calf as a carbon pesach, so it's not a justifiable error. Al ma nechleku al ru'uyim, if it's a case of a lamb, Rabbi Eliezer mechayiv chatos, Rabbi Yeshua poter. And our Mishnah that makes this distinction in Rabbi Yeshua between Re'uyim and Ein Re'uyim, and says that if it's Einam Re'uyim, if he shechts it, he's chayav, that reflects the sheet of Rabbi Shimon and not Rabbi Meir. Two different versions of the shita of Rabbi Yeshua. So let's just summarize the last point. How far does Rabbi Yeshua go when he says you're pot? Does that apply even to Einam Re'uyim? Which means that since he's involved on this day with karbanos that override the Shabbos, and mistakenly he went ahead and he shechted a karban shlomim l'shem Pesach or a karban shlomim l'shem emurei tzibur, since he's involved on that day with karbanos that override the Shabbos, he's considered Torah. That's the gorem that caused him to violate the Shabbos. Masha Enken, according to Rabbi Shimon, it's not justifiable to make a mistake when something is clearly not designated for shchita on Shabbos. You have a cow. We don't shecht the cow on Shabbos. It's not a korban pesach, and therefore even Rabbi Yeshua would agree that he's chayav. Omar Abibi, Omar Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Lazar, Poter Hay Rabbi Meir Afilu Egel Shel Zivchei Shlomim Sheshchato L'Shem Pesach. So you have a korban shlomim, and it's an egel, it's a calf. Well, I guess the British would say a calf. I can't say like they do. And he shechted it for the purpose of a korban pesach. Rabbi Meir goes as far as to say that according to Rabbi Yeshua, this is a tos, and he's tov b'dvar mitzvah. Even though, again, it seems so obvious that this could not be a korban pesach. How did he have in mind to shech this l'shem korban pesach? The answer is he was tarut. And even though a person doesn't usually make such a mistake, but he's tarut. He's somewhere, he meant to look for a seh, and he ended up with an egel. But all right, nischalfalo b'seh. So the Gemara asks, Omar le Rab Zera le Rab Bibi, the Omar Rab Yochanan, Modeh Haya Rabbi Meir b'Bali Mumin. Let's say a person shechted a korban that would normally, if it was a tmima without a blemish, it would be docha Shabbos, but it turns out that this korban that he shechted is a balmum. And according to Rabbi Yochanan, in such a case, he's going to be chayav. And why? Because everybody knows that you can't bring a korban that's a balmum on the mizbeach. Anyway, we see clearly from Rabbi Yochanan that Rabbi Meir did not pater you up unless it's a feasible mistake. But to say that he took an egel and he designated it as a korban pesach, that's not a feasible error. That's not a common error that people would make. You could make a mistake about a mum. You didn't see the mum. You didn't know it was a mum. Amal Leser, Rabbi Bibi says to Rabbi Zera, Rabbi Meir holds you potur, and he applies the principle of Tov B'Dvar Mitzvah, even in something that normally you would not make a swap, like a calf instead of a lamb. But B'Bali Mumin, Dilo Torid Bahu. The only exception is a case where there's no tirda. And that's a case of Bal Mum. That's where Rabbi Meir is going to hold you chayav. It's not Tov B'Dvar Mitzvah. That's not called tirda. Because a Bal Mum could never be brought on the Mizbeach. So you can't say he's torrid with some sort of akrovas karma. Right? At least in the case where he was unaware that this is an egel, but the egel could be brought on the mizbeach. It's not excluded from the mizbeach, so therefore he could consider him torah. And from the moment that he was magdish this calf for whatever carbon that was going to shlomim, he was already torah in bringing this carbon on the mizbeach. And it was a carbon that should be brought on the mizbeach. Instead, he brought it on Shabbos l'shem Pesach. That's called Tov B'Dvar Mitzvah. What would be the deal it was an animal that wasn't even sanctified and designated as a carbon. Miley Omer Rabbi Meir, what would Rabbi Meir say about that? Can you call him a Tov Dvar Mitzvah? Hamalei, Rav Nachman, to the surprise of Rava, says, Poter Hay Rabbi Meir, Afilu, even in the case of a Shochet Chulin, let's say it was a seh, it was a lamb, and it was Chulin, L'shum Pesach. So wait a second. Rava says to Rav Nachman, V'amar Rabbi Yochanan, Model Hay Rabbi Meir B'Bali Mumin. In other words, a Balmum can't be brought on the Mizbeach. A Chulin also can't be brought on the Mizbeach. So how can you call him Tarud over here? He doesn't even have a carbon that's right for the Mizbeach. So if Nachman says you shouldn't equate a Balmum with Chulin. Bali Mumin lo mechalfe. You would never make a mistake between a Balmum, which you can see with your eyes, the blemish on the animal, and think mistakenly that you could be bringing it on the korban. Hani, in the case of Chulin, Michlafe, it looks exactly identical to an animal that was kosher. We could say that he's a Tov B'Dvar Mitzvah. He thought that this behemoth is a kosher. The time of Rabbi Meir, so now Rava asks Kash again, he says, is the reasoning of Rabbi Meir Mishum de Ichlafe, the low Ichlafe? It all depends upon whether you could make a mistake because these two animals look identical, Chulin and Kodshu. V'amar Abibi, Amar Abi Loza, Potori Rabbi Meir, Afilu Egel Shel Zivchei Shlomin Sheshkato L'Shum Pesach. He shechted an Egel of Shlomin. This is clear. I mean, you're not blind. You could see it's not Roy Liv Pesach, and he shechted L'Shem Pesach. Alma time of the Rabbi Meir, Mishum de Tarid, that once he has a carbon, and it's a carbon shlamim, he's already tarid to bring it on the mizbeach, and he might think, let's bring it as a carbon pesach. So it has nothing to do with mischalef, that there are two identical animals here, because now we're talking about a case of an egel that clearly looks different than a lamb, than a set. And therefore, in the case of Behemoth Shel Chulin, where you don't have this svara of Tarid because he's not bringing a carbon. I mean, the Chulin is not shayach to his bath. You can't say he accepted upon himself to bring a carbon, and he's not Tarid. So how can you, Rav Nachman, say that Rabbi Meir would say in this case he's patur from a chatos? Rav Nachman responds to Rava that basically, according to Rabbi Meir, you're patur in one of two mistakes. One of two categories and scenarios. Number one, Tarid Afal Gavdalo Michlaf. He designated this calf as a carbon shlamim, so he's already Tarud in a Dvar Mitzvah to bring this calf on the Mizbeach, and now he made a mistake and he shechted L'Shem Pesach. Alternatively, Michlaf Afal Gavdalo Tarid, like in the case of Chulin, where he's not Tarud, he doesn't have a mitzvah to bring a carbon on the Mizbeach, but Michlaf, it looks identical. Lafuki Bali Mumin don't have either of these two elements. Lo Ichlachu Michlaf, it's clear that this is a Bal Mum, and Lo Mishatride, and he's not Torah in bringing a carbon. This is not an animal that's Omed La Krav Al Gabi Mizbeach, and therefore a mayor would say that you're chayav if you shechted a Bal Mum on Shabbos for the purpose of a Pesach. Yosef Rabbi Zera, Ve Rabbi Shmuel Bar Yitzchak. Ikla means he went to the outside, what we call a prosdor in front of the house, the chocolate. The Rabbi Shmuel Bar, Rabbi Yisrael Yosef V'Kamri, and he said the following: Omar Reb Shimon ben Lakish Neschaliflo Shipud Shel Nosar, Shipud Shel Tzli. In other words, he's got a spit, and on the spit, which was penetrated into a basa carbon, it was already nosar. It would already pass the zman achila, so you're not allowed to eat that meat. But he mistakenly thought it was a shipud shel tzvi of a basa carbon, and he has a mitzvah to eat it. So his kavanah was to eat basa kodshim, which is royal achila, and instead he ate basa nosar. V'achalo is chay of chatas. It's like any case of a person who mistakenly ate nosar. Even though again he was told about mitzvah, he thought that means a basa kodshim, and it's mitzvah to eat it, but nevertheless he's chayav. He didn't do a mitzvah by eating nosa. Rabbi Yochanan Omar, Ishto nida bal chayiv. If a man has a relationship mistakenly with his wife and she's a nida, he thought she was tahora, he has to bring a chakas. He didn't do a mitzvah by having be'ila with his wife who's a nida. But, and this is going to be a really perplexing ruling of Rabbi Yochanan, the vimto nida bal potter. But if he mistakenly, in order to fulfill the mitzvah of yibum, he had be'ila and she turned out to be a nida, which normally is a shogeg, the nida has to bring a chatas, here he's potter. So the Gemara now is going to quote two different traditions to explain Rabbi Yochanan, the chilik of Rabbi Yochanan, and whether or not Rabbi Yochanan rejects Reish Lakish, or he's just adding. According to the first lishon in the Gemara, that in the case where he's Baal Ishto Nida, Rabbi Yochanan says Yechayah. Even though, again, there is some element of a mitzvah here, because he had a be'ila with his wife, is kolshkein by he. How much more so would Rabbi Yochanan agree with Reish Lakish in the case of Ochal Nosar B'Shogeg, where Reish Lakish said he's chayav? The mechayev the lo asa mitzvah, because when you eat Nosar, there's no mitzvah at all, and when he had a be'ilah with his wife who's a nida, that's not called a mitzvah. But it's the Amri, we have a second version of Rabbi Yochanan by he in the case where he made a mistake and he ate Nosar, thinking that it was Basar Kodshim, Potter. Rabbi Yochanan would disagree with Reish Lakish, he would say you're Potter. And the only time he's Chayav according to Rabbi Yochanan is in the case of Baal Ishto Nida, my Taima. What's the logical distinction between the two cases? Why is Nosar different than Baal Ishto Nida? Hasam Hude Havile Lishiule. We cannot consider it a justifiable error when a man has Be'ilah with his wife who's a Nida. He should have asked her before he had the Be'ilah whether or not she's muteris lo or asur lo, is she a nida or not? And since there was an element of negligence here, we cannot consider him a toiv b'dvar mitzvah, and therefore he's chayiv chatzav al hacha. But in the case of a yavam with a yavama, lo havi le l'shiule. I'm sorry, I made a mistake. We didn't get to yavama yet. Sorry, I jumped the gun. But here in the case of Reish Lakish, where he sees a piece of meat on a shipud, who's he going to ask? There's no one to ask. He thought mistakenly that this was Basar Kodshim and there's a mitzvah to eat it. And it turned out to be Nosar, is low. Here, Rabbi Yochanan would disagree with Reish Lakish because it's a justifiable error. And the only time he agrees to Reish Lakish, he's chayiv, and it's not called Tos and a Shogeg, is when he should have asked his wife before he had Be'ilah. So the Gemara now tries to clarify the case of Ishto and the difference between Ishto Nida and Yevimto Nida. Rabbi Yochanan, what's the difference between Ishto and Yevimto? Ma'ishna Yevimto deloka aved mitzvah. In other words, if he had Be'ilah with his Yevama, and I'm sorry, Ma'ishna Yevimto dika avid mitzvah, right? He has a mitzvah to be boel his Yevama, to be mekayim the mitzvah of Yivum, and Rabbi Yochanan says, therefore, if he had beer with her when she was a nida, he's patur because of his tirda and the kiyama mitzvah. That's why he had a justifiable shogeg. Is ishtonami covered mitzvah? If he thinks mistakenly that she's tahora, then he's being mekayim the great mitzvah period of rivya. Again, I don't know if there's period of rivya, and every time a person has a relationship with his wife, maybe he already has children, but nevertheless, L'erev Tanach Yadechi should continue having children. That's also an extension of period of Rivia. And the Gemara answers, Be'ishto Muberes. Right, the Gemara is giving one example of many cases where he's having Be'ilah with his wife, and there's no possibility that through this Be'ilah he'd be Mekayim the mitzvah period of Rivia, because she's already pregnant. So that's not Torah B'dvar mitzvah, and therefore involved Be'ishto Nida, not like the case of Baal Yevimto, he's chayav achatas according to Rabbi Yochanan. But ika simchas ona, even if he's not chayav in the mitzvah period of Rivya, but there is a mitzvah to have a relationship with his wife, be ona. And the answer is shalom b'shas onasa. That Rabbi Yochanan was talking about a case where it's not the shas onasa. Right? Let's say if a person works at home, so he has a mitzvah of ona once a week. If he works out once every 3 months, and so on and so on. All the sugyas there, Masechta Ksubas. So now the Gemara asks the kasha, Omar Rava chayav onu l'samech as isha b'dvar mitzvah, even shalom b'shas ona, in a case where intimacy is natural and there's an attraction, he still has a mitzvah to have tashmish with his wife, to misameach his wife, even though it's not piri v'rivya, and even though it's not ona. So our answer is samach levesta, that she usually sees dam at around this time of the month, and he's not allowed to be mishamishar, even if there's an intimacy, a relationship, and that's not called a mitzvah. Okay, the man had a mitzvah of yibum, but not when it's samach levesta. She turns out to be a nida. That's not called Torah b'dvar mitzvah. And the Gemara answers, Yevimto buzzes mina. The ishtolo buzzes mina. In the case of an intimate relationship between a yavam, his late brothers and his wife, his sister-in-law, he's embarrassed. He's not going to ask her. They're not close, intimate relationship. It's very foreign, very strange to him. He's not going to ask her whether she's a nida or not. But ishto lo buzzes mina. But a person should not be embarrassed to ask his wife whether or not she's a nida. And therefore, he was guilty of negligence, so therefore he's not called a Torah b'dvar mitzvah. The Gemara asks for Rabbi Yochanan Kiman, and in the case of Baal Yevimto Nida, and we consider him a Torah b'dvar mitzvah, who shita amongst the Tanoim is he standing on? Ilema, if it's Rabbi Yossi, it's now we have a Mishnah in Sukkah. Rabbi Yossi, Omi Yotif Harishon Shal Chag Shechalios B'Shabbos. Now, the Torah says that you take the lulav even on Shabbos if it's the first day of Sukkot, and V'shachach, he forgot that it was Shabbos. What did I just say? I'm not sure what I just said. But anyway, what I meant to say is that there's no Gzeira D'Rabba yet. But again, you're not allowed to carry the lulav. Lulav doesn't override the Shabbos. V'shachach, but he forgot it was Shabbos. V'hotzias halulav mishus harabim, and he carried it for Rabbos and mishus harabim. And Rabbi Yossi says, meaning that he was Machal Shabbos because the Torah, he was tirda of a mitzvah of Netilas Lulav. And here also, if Rabbi Yossi says you're Potter and you consider the Torah b'dvar mitzvah because he did it because he wanted to be Mekayim mitzvah, so too, Rabbi Yochanan says, let's apply Rabbi Yossi's rule to the case of a person who's about to be Mekayim the mitzvah of Yibum, and it turned out that she was a Nida. Gemara says, Dilmachani Hasam is mano bohu. With regard to lulav, he's got an immediate mitzvah on this day. He can't delay it. So he's very torah, and he's running to find a baki who's going to teach him how to take the lulav and how to do nanuim and so forth and so on. So that's a justifiable tirda. But mitzvahs yibum, I don't get it. There's no kviyas man over here. He's not bohul. He doesn't have an immediate, he can postpone it for a while. The Ella, so rather we have to assume that Rabbi Yochanan is not standing on the shoulders of Rabbi Yossi, but Rabbi Yeshua disvachin. He must be standing on the shoulders of Rabbi Yeshua, who says that if a person shechts on Shabbos, a korban shlomim l'shem Pesach, he's considered tarud in the mitzvah of Pesach, and Torah b'dvar mitzvah is potter. He doesn't have to bring a korban. Here also, he's Baal Yevimto, he's Torah b'mitzvah. So Gemara says, Dilma Shani Hasam is different. Why? Nami's manabol, because again, you're talking about a case of a korban Pesach, and the korban Pesach has to be shechted before Shkia. So it's like lulav, you can't wait till the end of the day. So that's called tirda. But not so in the case of Baal Yevimto, the Ella, but rather, Rabbi Yochanan is Rabbi Yeshua the Tinokos. He's relying on Rabbi Yeshua of the Tinokos, and they brought him 2 Tinokos, and he circumcised mistakenly the baby that doesn't have Zman Mila today. He was tarud b'mila of a tinok that should be circumcised today, and instead he circumcised a baby whose mila is meant to be on Sunday. And in this case, Rabbi Yeshua says you're potur, even though he's not fulfilling a mitzvah by doing a milah on Saturday, which really should be done on Sunday. Hasam nami zman of bohu. There too, it's not like the case of Yavama, because there's a zman element here. He's got to make sure that the 8th day doesn't pass. The elok Rav Yeshua the truma. Desnan hoya ochel truma b'truma v'noda shu ben grucha ben chalutza. We thought this coin was a coin kosher. He's allowed and he's obligated to eat truma. Turned out he was a cholol, and he's not allowed to eat truma. It's Rabbi Eliezer Mechayev, Keren v'chomesh. He has to pay the Kohanim, or one particular Kohen, he has to pay him a Keren and a chomesh. That's called a zar shachol truma v'chogeg. And Rabbi Yeshua poter. Rabbi Yeshua says he's told b'dvar mitzvah. He doesn't have to pay for this because he thought he was a kohen kosher and he has a mitzvah to eat the truma. So we see clearly that Rabbi Yeshua patters you up as a told b'dvar mitzvah, even if it's not zmano bohu. There's no time limit in achilas truma. You can postpone it, and the same thing should apply in boel yivimto nida. Hence, we understand Rabbi Yochanan. Gemara rejects it. Dilma kidder Bibi barabai diomar Bibi barabaye b'truma. The Erev Pesach, we're talking about a truma of chametz on Erev Pesach. He's bold. It's man a bowl. He has got to eat this chametz before it becomes shasi suro, and he's going to have to burn it. So he's so preoccupied in eating the truma that Rabbi Yeshua says he's potter, even though he turns out to be a ben grucha ben chalutza. He's considered a Torah b'dvar mitzvah. But if he was eating truma on a different day of the year and it wasn't chametz, no pressing issue, he's not bold to eat it, then Rabbi Yeshua B'Modi would concede that he's chayav. Hence, we're still stuck with trying to understand Rabbi Yochanan in the case of Ba al Yevimta. Neither. Inami, the Gemara says, Shani Truma de Ikri Avoda. The Avoda Rachmana Achsher. In the case of a Cholol who does Avoda B'Shogeg, the Torah says that b'di'eved, we recognize post facto his avoda as being valid. And the Gemara is now going to equate truma with avoda, and the same principle that applies to avoda applies to truma, and therefore he's potter according to Rabbi Yeshua because it is a kiyum of mitzvah's truma, b'di'eved. He finds out he's a cholol, which passes all his avodah in the mikdash. It's called kabbalah school cheikrev al gabi mitzbech psulim. Rabbi Yeshua machshir. V'yamina my time in the Rabbi Yeshua. Why does Rabbi Yeshua say it's kosher if he went ahead and he did the avodah? And the answer is the chsiv, a pasuk in V'zos HaBracha. Moshe Rabbeinu blesses Shevet Levi. Barech Hashem Chelo Pol Yodav Tirtza. And the Gemara darshans this pasuk that even if his pu'ulas yadayim, his avoda, was that of a kohen cholol, nevertheless tirtza. Tirtza means ritzuyo l'fnei hamakom. His avoda is not possible because now l'mafrei we know that he was a chol. But no, he found out he was a chol after he did the avoda. We're not going to undermine and invalidate all the avodah that he did under the assumption that he was a kohen kosher. And since achilas truma is also called an avodah, as the Gemara is going to explain immediately, therefore a cholol is not chayav on this achila of truma. If he finds out after he ate the truma that he was a ben grusha ben chalisa cholol and he's possible, but this has nothing to do with Torah b'dvar mitzvah. Therefore, once again, we still don't have really a source for Rabbi Yochanan's premise. With Truma Hechi Ikre Avoda, where do we see that Truma is called an Avoda? The sign you have in a Brisa. Rabbi Tarfon was a Kohen. Ma'asav Rabbi Tarfon Shalom Ba Emesh. Yesterday at night, he didn't show up in the base medrash. He gave up on the mitzvah Talmud Torah. Why were you absent yesterday? Rabbi Tarfon answered him, Avoda Avadati. I was doing the avodah of a korban, of a Kohen. Hamalos, Rabbi Gamliel says, called Rechainam El Divrei Tema. I can't begin to understand what you're talking about. If you avodah bisman and say the mikdash is already charev, is minayin. How could you be doing an avodah? Hamalos, Rabbi Tarfon says, Harehu Omer. Pasuk says about Midbar Yudches. Here we'll turn to Daf Ayin Gimel. It says that Hashem says to Aaron HaKohen, Avodas matana etein esku naschem v'azor akariv yumos. Now, Avodas matana is a reference to what we call matnas kahuna. Right? The word matana here in this context means matnas kahuna. And it's considered like an avoda because it says avodas matana. So therefore, also achilas truma, and the Torah is considered achilas truma even outside the Beis Hamikdash, bigvulin, avodas Beis Hamikdash, and therefore it's considered as one of the matnas kahuna. That's what Rabbi Tarfon. That's what I had in mind when I said avodasi avoda, and I didn't come yesterday to the Beis Hamedrash because I was too busy with the mitzvah of achilas truma, which is called an avoda. And here there's a long, long discussion here about how Rabbi Tarfon could be mavatel Talmud Torah for the sake of the mitzvah of achilas truma. We have a principle that Talmud Torah is the greatest of all mitzvahs, and he should have come to the Beis Medrash and given up on the mitzvah of achilas truma, or at least postponed it. He could have done it later. And the answer is apparently from the Netziv Mivalojin that this is the famous sheet of Rabbi Tarfon in Masechta Kedushin Daf Mem, that mitzvahs are greater than Talmud Torah, and Talmud Torah is nidches with a mitzvah, even if it's a mitzvah that he could postpone or a mitzvah he could do through a shliach. Nevertheless, he should be doche Talmud Torah, Gadol Talmud shemevi lidei mais. Okay, Rabbosai. Whatever we did, we did. We probably could have spent literally a week on this sugya without, probably much more, without being bored. Just to give you a taste of iyun, to give us an appetite for learning the iyun. Okay then? Thank you. Have a great day.